Like if you don't have anything nice to say, or it's not my place to tell them, or I don't want to be a burden, all of those narratives, terrible for social connectivity.
You're listening to The Shift Show, where we use psychological insight to unravel the craziness of life for you. You growth mindset person, you. Tune in every other Thursday to hear some wacky psychologists demystify what exactly is happening in that weird organ that lives inside your skull. And for this especially delicious podcast experience, we can thank our friends at Shift Psych, the people who deliver a results-driven and innovative approach in therapy land. Throughout the podcast, we'll throw down some serious psych gems, but these are certainly not a replacement for treatment by a psychologist or a psychiatrist. So please seek one out if you need help.
Hey, Andrea, how's it going? It's been a while.
Good. How you been?
Good. Today we're talking about something really cool. We're talking about, right, like at Shift, we're obsessed about, creating happiness and contentment and getting over difficult things and stuff like that. And today we wanted to talk about a really important topic surrounding that, which is like, how do you want to frame the whole conversation in the first place?
Well, I think we're noticing a lot of loneliness and social isolation. And I mean, this couldn't be better timed because we were talking about this in the wake of the pandemic.
Yeah.
But even before that, it's a chronic problem that we're seeing expressed with our clients and, people in our lives and in society at large more and more is this kind of epidemic of loneliness. Mm-hmm. So to go with our pandemic of COVID, totally. I think we're as a society experiencing a lot of social isolation. So we just wanted to talk a little bit about why is it important in the first place? What are the benefits of it? What are the risks involved in having a lot of social isolation? And, where does it come from? Like, why is this happening to us as a society and as individuals more and more? And then also, just because we don't want to completely depress y'all, what can we do about it? And how do you make significant impact in your community and in your lives to have those enriching and protective social connections? So we're going to talk about all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And I think that, so if we're talking about like loneliness and social isolation, to me, that speaks to like a particular need that's not being met, which is actual social connection. Right.
Yes. I think that's what we're going to kind of bundle it as the social connectivity.
Right. And so, tell me about that. Why is social connection important in the first place?
I'd say the first reason it's so important is it's the biggest protective factor. Mm-hmm. In mental health, it's one of the biggest things that, it makes us feel better. It makes us feel supported. It's a preventative factor. Like the more social connections we have as children, the more positive attachment figures, the more adaptive we are. We see that in adulthood as well. We feel protected. Like if you have a friend to call when you're not feeling great, if you've got a community or a network or a church group around you, we feel good and connected. Isolation does not do nice things to the human mind because we're a tribal creature, right? From an evolutionary perspective. So we're not supposed to. It's also a source of purpose and meaning. I don't think most people on their deathbeds are asking for their profit and loss statement or if one more run in their Mercedes. It's always people, right? Mm-hmm. Like 9 times out of 10, it's people that they're asking for. So it does speak to the source of purpose and meaning that people gain. And the other part of it is like, it's fun. Like it's way more fun to go do stuff, generally speaking, with somebody there to participate in your life or to share it with, whether it's, going on a hike or raising a child or whatever. It's often, nice to have those shared experiences, be they good or bad. So it de-stresses a situation when you've got a helper, right? Mm-hmm. You've dealt with some screaming toddler action before. It's probably helpful when your wife is there in it, even if you're both. It's a total
like tag team sort of thing where it's literally like, I need to tag out and right.
Or even if it's just both of you with your hands in the air being like, what is going on? Right.
Or to have somebody there to collapse next to you at the same time when the kids are all asleep and it's like, can we both just enjoy the silence for like a minute?
Exactly. That shared experience is really important to humans. The other thing is it comes into like social connectivity isn't just in friendland, right? So we've got it in romantic relationships. It comes in parenting relationships, and it even comes with a connectivity we see with like animals and pets. These are very, very satisfying natural behaviors for humans. So that's why it's so important. Mm-hmm. And we'll get into the details of, what are the basis of this need.
Yeah,
I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, like when you talk about like the evolutionary side of things too, like I like to think about this as, if we're thinking of it in terms of the history of human beings in general, we are a very social animal, right? Mm-hmm. So like these primates got smart enough, they became more social and created tribes and groups. And the reason that they perpetuated, like we as Homo sapiens perpetuated and were the dominant species, were because we're the social connections that we had, and that we could rely on each other, and that we could, right, and that we have, and so it's baked right into our DNA and into our brain structure and what our needs are. We are entirely designed for that.
Well, and we can see evidence of that. If we look at our nearest genetic relatives, the chimpanzees. And we've studied them quite a bit. Thank you, Ms. Goodall, for that one. And, you look at, there's these hierarchical structures in their communities and how they bond, how they relate to each other, how even the act of grooming is a bonding thing, and how there's some different kind of emotional rules or body language codes. There's tiffs, and then there's love relationships. There's different types of bonds, between the mother chimp and her child, or, the two brother chimps that roughhouse. We have a lot of those things still, and we have a lot of need for those things. So if we go back also, speaking of the evolutionary basis of the need, we've got it. The biggest one is it's protective. Because humans, I don't know about you, even when I get my nails did, they're not great claws, right? We're not really equipped with the giant fangs or, the speed of the cheetahs or whatever. We don't have some of these physical adaptations which other animals have to, outrun predators or to be the predators. We didn't have a lot of those. We still don't have a lot of those. So what our strength was, kind of like the honeybee, is like in groups, right? Group organization. So that would help us protect our young. It would also help us, mobilize in groups and figure out where to go to find sources of food. Someone goes out to the hunter and gatherer side of things. On the gatherer side, you can figure out, and you've got hands to harvest. And then it also is that shared resources. So because humans were able to share the work, so maybe Zac, you're off hunting some deer for the tribe, and I'm off, gathering berries, and somebody else is watching the babies while we do that. Because they were able to do that, it led to the ability to advance a bit too. So you're able to, like, what is that saying? Many hands make light work.
Right.
That kind of thing. And that allowed us to actually advance civilization. So we were able to do things like, even very early in our nomadic kind of indigenous societies, they were able to do things like crafting and beading and stuff that was for aesthetics, or the development of drumming and music. And that went on to things like the domestication of animals and plants, and that allowed us more license to do other things, and so on, until we get to the advancement of our societies today. So that group think and that team focus or tribal focus is wildly responsible for many, many things in humanity. So it's extremely important.
Well,
so
and I think that is a really good, like a modern day example of that as well, is that, if you've just got something going on in your life, just pick any sort of problem, right? And if you're just left to your own devices to deal with it, I'm blanking on an example in the moment, right? But just something's going on that's challenging, right? Or even just like, I've got a leak in my roof, right?
There we go.
Where it's like, okay, well,
why do I go to building a boat? That's weird.
No, that's okay. But yeah, so like if you have like a leak in your roof, it's like, okay, well, left to my own devices, I'm literally like, I don't know, for those of you old enough to remember the Red Green Show, right? like duct tape and like garbage bags is likely what I'm doing, right? But because everybody's kind of good at something different, and, to literally even just to have somebody be like, what the hell are you doing? No. Come over here. Right. And
definitely.
Let me help you. Or, that social connection is like very valuable, I think, in that sense as well.
So we see it on this macro level with the social connectivity allowing us these advancement pieces, which allow some of us to work in areas where we like it better. So maybe somebody likes gathering the berries back in the day and somebody likes hunting. Well, now maybe it allows you to be a psychologist and somebody else to be a physician or whatnot, right? So we're splitting these things up. And so it speaks a bit to purpose. And we see a bit in terms of the advancement of anything. Like, even at Shift, right? One of the reasons that we're able to advance what we're doing with psychology is because we have a strong team focused on it, right? It's not just all one type of skill. So that diversification of thought is wildly important as well. But on the individual level, if we go back to the protective factors, it is very important, like human connection from a very early age is, which we refer to as attachment, right? In infants is the thing that keeps infants alive. So from a very, very basic life, death need, we need that connection. And we continue to need it in different ways as we go through the lifespan, right? Yeah. So it's very much hardwired on a community level for humans, but also on an individual level. Right. And we see what happens when there are deficits in early attachment. We see a lot of attachment trauma, and it has long lasting negative effects on the epigenetics. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think that it's just as hardwired, like, especially, you think of like babies when they're first born, they are biologically wired to seek out faces, for example, right? They're looking for mom's face and they don't even know they're doing it. In the same way that they are seeking for nutrition from the mother as well, right? And I think that when we say that it's something that we need, it's something that we are biologically driven to seek out.
Yes.
And so that, and when we don't have that, like, sure, maybe, maybe there's variation within that as far as like maybe somebody's a little bit more introverted, but even if you're introverted, that doesn't mean that you don't need social connection.
Yes.
It's just a different style of it.
So when
there's certain preferences or
exactly
or things like
and amounts and roles, right? And when we don't have it, what it does is it activates us. So we increase our anxiety related behaviors. And there's a host of things that happen when humans are activated
like
or triggered.
Learned helplessness and depression and addiction. Yeah.
Like basically everything.
You try and fill the void basically.
Yeah. Everything is helped with connectivity, right?
Yeah.
And not to say that everything is caused by a lack of social connection, but I'd say almost every single mental blip, mental disorder, challenge in life is made better or easier, is improved by improving the social connectivity.
Yeah. And I mean, that's also bared out in research around, like life expectancy of people who are married versus not married, or people who are well connected to, I'm familiar with research around like people who are very active in church groups, for example.
Yep.
Life expectancy in those groups tends to be higher because they're more socially connected and things like that too.
Definitely. So there is definitely, like I said, there's an epigenetic and physiological consequence to a lack of social connection as well. Yeah. Very much so. With lifespans and also a propensity for developing a lot of different physical disorders, like you're higher risk for diabetes and such, heart disease and so on. So there's a lot of reasons. So I kind of think we've established why social connection is really, really important and kind of where it came from. Mm-hmm. Maybe let's talk a little bit about how it forms.
Sure.
So how do you get that social connection? Like, what is it made of?
Yeah. And I feel like you and I were talking about this a while ago when we were kind of throwing this idea around beforehand. Mm-hmm. I feel like early on in life, it comes from just our immediate environment. In fact, a lot of it often can, right?
Yeah. Assuming you have a healthy immediate environment, that's where it is. You play with your siblings, you hang out with your mom, you do a puzzle with your dad.
You go to school eventually, right? And then you end up connecting with other people. And then, some of these other things as well. You start to gravitate towards people who are similar to you.
Yeah, maybe you're doing the same hobby. You're in band club. You play on a baseball team. That's a sort of thing.
Hey, there's a kid over there who brought Pokemon cards at recess. I'm going to gravitate over there because, those kinds of things end up happening very often.
Exactly. So it's just kind of a natural thing often, assuming that there's a healthy environment there. Like we'll chat a little bit later about what happens when there isn't.
Right.
But social connectivity in like super short form, I think, is born out of some shared goals or shared experience, right? So whether that's a hobby or an interest or even something tragic sometimes, if we go through, like we know there is higher social connectivity that occurs after, say, a disaster. They map this after 9/11, that there is more social cohesion and more social connectivity coming out of that because it's a shared experience, like a negative one, but a shared one.
And even anecdotally, I know that even in talking to clients around this whole COVID lockdown situation, there are a lot of people that I've talked to who have said, I've talked more to my mother in the past, 2 months than I have forever. Or, like that people are actually like, wow, I actually would like to talk to this person. And there is more intention to reach out because of the shared experience of that too.
Well, and shared experience creates often alignment, right? So we're on the same page. We've both done this. We can talk about it. There's something there. So shared goals is another one, right? If you're working on a project with somebody, that project might be raising children. That project might be, learning to salsa dance or working on a work project, that kind of stuff. The other one is shared values and intent. So this is where we get people, if you mentioned the church group idea or people that, really see an interest in the same political alignment or whatever in that regard. We also see it in like online groups or whatnot. The other one though, that has to be there for that deeper level of social connectivity that goes beyond the we all play on the same baseball team kind of level, which isn't to say that's not connected, but there's levels of it. We want like the deepest level of it. The deepest level of social connectivity is born out of emotional reciprocity. So it's like, I'm going to share and be vulnerable and open so you can know me, and then you're going to do the same, and I'm going to be interested in that, and you're going to be interested in this. And so the back and forth of that, that's the major piece to it. And that's how we make deeper social connections quicker. So it's that vulnerability piece plus that shared reciprocal piece with the vulnerability, right?
Totally. Well, and I think that's huge. And I could crack open a whole side conversation of like, very shallow friendships often, stereotypically granted, right? Not always, but like particularly between men, right?
Yeah.
Who are generally not very vulnerable with each other, right?
Well,
There's a lot of this like, dude, bro, how's it going? Whatever, but it's all,
Well, I think like men are often conditioned that their friendships relate to an activity.
Yeah.
Right. So you go hang out, you go watch the game, you build the fence or whatever. Whereas I think women more often, and obviously not saying all the time, but more often you will see women just like hanging out.
Yeah.
Right. They're having a glass of wine in the yard. There's not necessarily like an activity with it. It's that social exchange. And that's probably a bit of an evolutionary thing. Like tribally, you guys would be off like going to hunt or organizing something, and we'd be like, chitter chattering around, tending a fire and children and whatever. Right. So there is a bit of an evolutionary basis in theory to that. But it does present certain problems for the social connectivity insulation of men, particularly in this society. And we'll let's get into talking about some of the things that interrupt social connection then, since we're kind of going that way anyways.
Well, I was going to say in the situation of men, I think that in, one of the exceptions to that, to the between men kind of friendship or social connection, is, when you think of and again, we're drawing on stereotypes. They're a stereotype for a reason. Yeah. Right. Having said that, right. But like, it's at least common enough, right? The exception between men is like military, right? Where there's this like deep trust, brotherhood, we've shared experience, shared
definitely
goal, right? And I think that to your, like from an evolutionary perspective, the males kind of being out more as hunters, protectors, there's some similarities there. But as far as, actually having, not having those shared goals or just not having
and there's been a lot of investigation into when military, like when soldiers come back, how much they miss being with everybody. And so there's a couple things that are happening there, right? We've got definitely the shared experience and the shared goal, right? And then you've got often some emotional vulnerability and emotional reciprocity because of that, because you might be in a situation where it's not possible to hold back from being vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
If you see something tragic or something happens to you, you're going to display some emotion. Generally, that's met with another display of emotion, right?
Absolutely.
In healthy functioning individuals. So you've got all of these things, and you've got shared values, like you're fighting for your country, for your flag. So it kind of hits all of them.
Yeah.
And then you've also got company. You've got companionship like 24/7.
Yeah.
Which is something that, when we get into isolation, you come back home, you're maybe living with somebody that hasn't been through the experience now that you've been through, or you don't have somebody around you all the time when you're used to having a whole squadron of people. So it's understandable, but it gives us a nice model for what humans actually do really well with, even if the circumstances are really shitty.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's a great example. There's a couple things that get in the way of it, and we can talk about different things for different groups as well. But let's go over just maybe the general, like the gist of what screws with it, and then we'll talk maybe a little bit about how those things are showing up very specifically in an applied sense in our society now.
Cool.
Okay.
Yeah.
So first of all, like when we can't read or interpret emotions properly, that's like a social deficit thing.
Totally.
So we can see that sometimes popping up in things like bullying, some certain conditions, right? Like autism, but also in just people that aren't very socially conditioned, right?
Yeah.
If you grew up in a home where people weren't showing you and modeling really positive social behaviors, it's unlikely that you'll just inherently know them.
Yeah.
Or it might take you a while. Right?
Well, there's part of the, like from the biological side and the developmental side, right? Like the reason that the baby's looking for the faces is because that's essential to be able to learn about emotion. It's not inherently written into the baby what emotion is and how to understand it and how to do it.
Yeah.
It learns how to
interpret
and how to communicate emotion back to another person and how to be vulnerable and all of those things. You have to learn how to do those things.
Yeah, they recognize emotion. Like they know like angry face is bad, but they don't know like why it's bad or whatnot. And then as children grow up, they begin to understand like, oh, when I rip the toy out of your hand, then you make that angry face and that's not good. And now you don't like me and you don't want to play with me.
Right.
These types of exchanges are what educate us in how to work with other people. They're also the thing that develops empathy. So heightened emotional states are another thing that removes people's ability to socially connect. We see this, say, in some clinical presentations like the borderline personality disorder. They're often in a heightened emotional state, which makes their relationships unstable because they don't trust them, and then people find it hard to negotiate with that, right?
Yeah.
And that's a little bit of like the limiting belief, like the walnut brain being present. The walnut brain isn't really super great at making friends. It's very selfish.
Totally.
It's meant to just protect you from pain.
Yeah.
The cognitive mind has to be employed. So when we have too many activated limiting beliefs, the walnut gets a little hyperactive and he runs off with the baton and is like driving the whole show, which kind of screws the whole thing up because your cognitive brain is the one that makes friends basically, or makes connections. And it might not just be friends. It might be in parenting relationships or romantic relationships. So one of the things that we work on, and we'll chat about this in the latter half of this podcast, is deactivating the walnut brain so that the cognitive brain, where your values live, where your shared interests live, where your shared goals live, like the ability to create those, that's what we want driving it. So
well,
anytime
and I think
there's
I wonder too if like there is still, I know like often in our work we talk about the walnut brain, right? Or for the science people at home, the limbic system, right? The automatic part of your brain, right? There's also this other part of it that like we're talking a lot about, like when it becomes activated and it's like activating the stress response and things like that, right? I do think that there is a role of, when things like oxytocin and things like that is a little bit more of that like emotional part of your brain that has to be comfortable, but also then facilitates bonding as well.
Yeah, I would say, like, why don't we refer to it as like the maladaptive expression of the walnut brain? Yeah. And this is why we call it, by the way, the walnut brain, because he's an innocent little guy. He's got a good heart. He does good things too, right?
He's like,
he does cuddling. He does also save your ass from like the creepy guy walking down the alley in the dark. Like he's got some good roles. We don't want him to completely leave because really bad things happen when that happens, right? And you die also. He's also responsible for that because emotions do serve a purpose, right? They basically, like in short form, they give us the language to interact well with others, right? For that group cohesion to occur. Even like I said, if we go back into the chimpanzee, example, when one chimp's doing something, the other one takes the mango from him or whatever, and one makes a face. That's the communication that these are the rules of engagement. If you do this, you make me upset and then I don't like you, or when you do this, you make me happy and I'm delighted. So do more of that. So that's how humans formed groups, right? We still use those things to maintain our group, like our communities and our groups, like let people know.
And to your point too, like I think that cognitive brain needs to be the one in the driver's seat because you need to be able to understand what the other, like you have to be able to both send and receive social connection in order to be able to make this work.
Because the cognitive brain is the one that's interpreting it. We still want the walnut brain on the bus, but he's just not driving it. He's like a bad driver. It's like you can drive your kids around all day, but don't let your 5-year-old take the wheel because that's kind of what's happening if the walnut brain gets that. And then you're all of a sudden off on some adventure that you don't want to be at.
Why are we at grandma's house again?
Yes. Right? And then why did we hit the boulevard trees on the way there?
Totally.
So that kind of thing. So when we've got those activated limiting beliefs, that will do that. The heightened emotional states, the maladaptive expression of the walnut brain. And obviously some conditions like I mentioned, autism, we got addiction will do this, traumatic brain injury will do this. There's a whole bunch of things that get the like DSM medical stamp label that will interrupt social connectivity. Not to say it cannot be worked with. It just might have to be worked with in a bit of a different way, right? Yeah. It's not like, well, you're a write-off now. That's it. No, it just needs like a couple of little tweaks and things. And they're different for different conditions. We won't get into that right now because this isn't a clinical podcast today. Another thing that poses some problems for social connectivity is if the medium is very weak for social cues. So in the case of like text messages, social media, that kind of thing, or like a disrupted home environment, like if the child can't cue because the people are, high or just not present or whatnot, dealing with some maybe severe mental health issues, that's an environment that's weak for social cues because they're inconsistent. But so many of us get involved in text messaging or social media exchanges where we're missing, like humans are made to do this in person, which is actually why we chose to do this podcast in person today. Right? Because I was like, I want to see, what did I say? I want to see deep into your eyes, Zac, and see what your soul is saying. But I also want to read your body language. And I also want to hear the tone of your voice because that's the full experience of like understanding how to interpret like what you're feeling, what you're saying. And it's so much easier.
Well, and think about like what percentage, if you were to say like, clients coming in saying, oh, I had a fight with my partner, what percentage of them either are, had alcohol involved or the fight was over text?
Oh, no, we had to start, like you and I have talked about this. We had to start asking specifically, did you speak the fight or did you
write a tirade on your phone and then send it?
Yeah, because that's interpreted completely differently. I mean, I'm sure we've all sent one of those emails or gotten one of those emails where you're like, is that person pissed at me? Like, what is good? They say that seems like a jerk thing. And then you talk to them and they're like, no, I just wanted you to not leave your coffee mug on the copier. Like, that's all. But because humans are equipped at reading so many things. Like, what was it? Gottman had done studies on how many, like hundreds of thousands of facial micro movements we have. That's just your face. That's just your face. It's not even your posture. It's not the tone of your voice. I mean, what they're studying this with AI right now and how incredibly difficult it is to get an AI program to read facial movement. There's two professors out of MIT at the moment. I don't recall their names. Sorry, professors. They're working on that. And I mean, for them to map something like 20 was a massive challenge. And we have more than 20 emotions.
They had, so there's a show on Disney Plus called The World According to Jeff Goldblum. And he's just being Jeff Goldblum, going around being weird and doing things that are exciting to him. On an episode about sneakers, he visited Adidas, I think is what it was.
Yeah.
And they have like a hat with like a face scanner and they show people shoes and they say like athletes or their target demographic or whatever. If you ask somebody, hey, this is what do you think about this shoe? They're like, I don't know, it's pretty cool. But then if you look at the actual face thing that says disappointed or disgust or whatever, right?
These two MIT professors are the ones that developed that.
Interesting. Okay,
that
cool.
technology that you're talking about. Sorry, we're not using names because I don't have it in front of me and I'm terrible with them. But
Right. But go check that out. That's cool.
Go check that out. It was awesome. I think Hidden Brain did a wonderful podcast on it. I think it was Hidden Brain. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very interesting. But we need the context for intimate exchanges. I mean, text is wonderful for like, hey, Zach, I'm going to be 5 minutes late. Hey, Zach, do you want me to pick up pizza on the way here? Mm-hmm. Hey, Zach, emoji, hope you have a great day.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff.
I am insanely guilty of overusing the smiley face, just literally the colon and the close bracket in emails and everything, because I'm just like, I would way rather it come off tacky and cheesy than to have it be
I agree.
Any sort of whatever. I'm just like, I'll throw that in all the time.
Zach and I do a lot of emojis back and forth. I'm an emoji person, but that's why the whole emoji thing occurred, is the text thing doesn't read like it. So anyway, point being, that is one of the things. A low context rich environment does interrupt social connection. So when we think that we are, having these deep social connections with people because we're having a text exchange, that may be true if it's supplemented with other forms of communication. And the more context you get, the better it is, right? So if we're having a phone call, you're going to be able to hear the tone of my voice and the intonation and da-da-da-da-da. So that helps. And then obviously like moving next into like, a lot of us are these days on the teleconferencing, right? So you see somebody and then you hear them and da-da-da-da. So that's even better.
Yep.
And then obviously the best.
So here's a question too that I think is, and maybe we're getting to this. Can we talk about the illusion of connection for a minute?
Yes.
Because the number of people, we say, oh, well, like, what do you do? How many people do you stay in contact with? Oh, well, like,
oh God, yeah.
I talk to my kids on Facebook, or, I see my grandchildren's photos on Facebook.
Okay.
And that's somehow like me keeping up with their life.
Well, okay. We worked on this because like we in the back, I'm like, get really heated about this. And then I just say we like 14 times.
I know, that's why I brought this up.
We get really, okay. He knows it's a passion point area. I'm like, Andrew, pull yourself together. Talk about this intelligent. So we actually do a whole bunch of training in the background for our psychs, right? So Zach and I were building out some of the training for our intake. And we realized when we were asking people about what their social life is like, we had to be super detailed because you're like, oh, I've got a lot of friends. Well, I've got a lot of friends looks a lot of different ways, right? So it's like, I've got friends that I regularly connect with. We talk on the phone. We go to dinner, pre-COVID, obviously.
Yeah.
We hang out.
You'd
we
have
share
to ask
our
things
deepest.
like specific, like when was the last time you did? How often do you do that? Does that feel like it's often enough? Would you like to do it more? Like,
and then you go into the emotional part of that. So that's the frequency part, which we had to get down and figure out a way to get all of our psychs to ask those types of questions. But then there's also like, hey, even though you see that guy so often that you're best buddies with, are you able to tell him that, you're not having a great time in your marriage, or that you're really struggling with the idea of whether to have children or not? Like, are you able to have these emotionally vulnerable conversations as well? So we needed ways to measure all of that, because that is what would give us a picture of how functional that person's social connectivity index is. Because again, it's such a massive one, and it breeds a whole bunch of stuff for us. We need to know what limiting beliefs are involved. So say we've got the person who's got, lots of friends, goes out with the guys all the time, is on the softball team, goes for drinks, had great workmates, but none of them know anything about what he's feeling. That has a very different picture for what we need to work on. And that would be into the realm of like, why is there no ability to do the emotional vulnerability thing versus somebody that, games all day and all their friends are online and they don't actually see them or interact with them. Maybe they're a little bit more emotionally vulnerable, but there's that complete absence of the actual physical presence in the world.
Yeah.
And then we take and say another scenario, we've got the busy mom who has those or had those really strong connections and relationships and now has an external barrier in the way of how her life is organized, and it presents an inability to see and connect and access that. So different sorts of things. But it's just that it's important to know what yours are, and it's important for us to know what our clients are, because it changes the picture of what we're doing, especially since this is like the biggest thing.
Yeah.
Out of all the things that we will address in terms of life optimization, the social connectivity thing is like the absolute biggest.
Well, and I think that the other thing that's coming to mind too is that sometimes this feels like all you really like. When we think about like what the average adult, what their social connection looks like, I think that we look at it and say, oh, I don't know, I guess that's normal. So, and so therefore it's fine. When, yes, that is probably what the average person has, but it's also probably inadequate to meet a really fulfilled, happy, satisfied life.
I feel like it's like my linguistics class that I took in university where I got a 5. By the way, I'm old, so this was on a 9 scale. I got a 5 and I felt really bad. And then I realized that everyone else got like a 5 or less. So then I just felt like really good about being really bad.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like that. You have to watch what your comparisons are. Because if we're shooting for ideal realities, which is what we're in, I'm not interested in like functional. I'm interested in people being like fucking amazing.
Yeah.
So when we're looking for that level, we have to look back to those like evolutionary structures and cues. What makes us most happy? What makes us most adaptive? And that's why we did a bunch of research on like what does make people the most happy. And we'll post some studies eventually on one day about that.
And I like again, framing it in that evolutionary mindset, right? Like imagine the perfect tribe. Right? What does the life of the average person do? They know their job really well. They're really good at it. They're really well fit to their job. They're really well connected with their community.
They're almost never alone.
They're almost never alone, right? And when they do, like they're using that alone time, for their own personal benefit, right?
They have mentors that are built into the structures.
Absolutely. Right? Yeah. And that they feel and they rally around each other when they're having different, difficulties and issues and situations. It's a shared burden.
Band together in the face of adversity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And like those things are the things that we need. And I know we keep going back to this like evolutionary tribe structure, which sounds irrelevant, but those things do display.
Oh, it's insanely irrelevant. It's insanely relevant, I should say. Like,
100%.
Yeah.
Well, because it's like we didn't just grow up and be like, like that. And I think we see that sometimes with clients when they talk about things that they're talking about their child and they're like, oh, I got over that. And I was like, that's like getting over the foundation of your house being cracked.
Right.
Like that doesn't work. It's your original programming. That's like getting over your original software code being all glitchy, but like magically now it works. Yeah. There's no button that we press when we're 18 that we're like, hey, all that shit that happened and all those things that were programmed, button, clear, no worries.
Yeah.
Like that's not how it works. It's the same thread.
Well, and it's the exact same that, if there was an animal that grew up in the wild and then, or even if it didn't grow up in the wild, just an animal in general, like when it's put in a zoo, it needs to have at least a bare minimum quality of life, right? And that's really what humans are anyways. It's just a different kind of thing.
Well, it was interesting because I was talking to a zoologist friend of mine and she was saying sometimes they'll do everything to control for the environment and like, they get the right food mix and they get the right amount of sunlight and they get the right like physical environment and and these animals will just spontaneously die. And she's like, we couldn't figure it out. And it speaks back to that, that study with the wire monkey and then the towel monkey.
Yeah.
So I don't know who did it again. I'm terrible with names, but there was it was a study on nurturance versus food. So the wire framed monkey.
Literally just like a wire frame skeleton of a monkey.
Yeah. That had food. That was the feeding one.
It had like the feeding tube, like
And then there was one with like terry cloths that was like cuddly. And then they brought baby monkeys in and they would go quickly and grab the food, but then they would go and hang out and snuggle. And sometimes it would actually create a preference structure where they preferred the snuggly, cuddly monkey fake mom versus the food. So that's still
like
in
they
us.
would almost avoid eating sometimes, if I remember right. Whereas it was like they were probably even a little bit underfed
Nourished,
because they would spend so much time with the cuddly one.
Yeah. So I think we've like stressed a lot about how this is. The other thing that gets in the way of social connectivity is when we can't display emotion or we can't display appropriate emotion, we see massive social deficits. So fear of vulnerability. So those would be the cognitions like I'm at risk, I'm unwanted, I'm not good enough, or inflexible role structures. So that's a lot of societal messaging often, like boys don't cry, be a man, what will the neighbors think, like all of that stuff of like behave in this way that is antithetical to how you feel. Yeah. Right. So anything that blocks the display of appropriate emotions as a communication thing gets in the way of our ability to socially connect. Right. Even, you know, if somebody like throws a dig at you and you don't correct it, you're actually moving away from social connection. Because if you said something and you like put a little jab at me or something, or said something that offended me, and I went, hey, Zac, like, I don't like that because of da-da-da-da, or this makes me feel whatever, then we have something to negotiate with, and then we can get over it. If I just go and take it away in my head and go, Zac's an asshole, da-da-da-da, and like brew about that and get all resentful, that's removing our ability to socially connect, right? Totally. Like, and quite permanently, right? Because the next time it happens and so on and so on. Versus like, I step on your toe, you go, hey, you're on my toe, we talk about it, it's fine. So that's the thing that gets in the way of the radical candidate.
And like avoiding it until you can successfully pretend it didn't happen is
not a thing.
Not an effective way to do it at all.
Because then you're shaping a dynamic. We'll talk about that in another podcast.
Yep.
That will be on relationships and role dynamics. Yeah. Anyway, the other one, and it's kind of speaking to this one, is social programming. Like if you don't have anything nice to say, or it's not my place to tell them, or I don't want to be a burden, all of those narratives, terrible for social connectivity. Because social connectivity, you know that stupid thing when people say like, just be authentic.
Yeah.
Very difficult to do, but also incredibly true.
Yeah.
So when we see a level of dissonance behind, you know, you've got like what's happening in your mind, like the little da-da-da-da-da-da, and then what's coming out your mouth, when there's a difference between those in situations where it, like overall, like obviously don't tell your boss that you think he's an asshole. Zac, don't tell your boss that you think she's an asshole. But like, you know, there's certain situations where it's an adaptive to shut your mouth.
Yeah.
But if the shutting your mouth is happening in the vast majority of your life, that's not good. Or if it's happening with somebody that you're supposed to be or that you want to be socially connected to. So if that's happening, say with your wife or with your best friend or with somebody that you want to be close friends with, that's a problem, right? So
especially if it's like very black and white, very all or nothing, right? Where like whether it's you forgot the, you know, your cup on the copier, or you know, you cheated on your wife, right? Or whatever it is, right? Like where it's both of those, and it's like this level of intensity seems to be the same. That's weird.
Well,
right?
And I would say that's. I agree. And I think one of the reasons that this happens so very much is that humans have this like one giant misconception. We think that the more vulnerable and the more open and the more of our scars and sores that we show, the less people will like us.
Yeah.
And that is so completely insanely dead wrong. It's not even funny. Yeah. Now, not in social media land. Like that is polished and airbrushed and whatnot. Right. But in reality, if you show some emotional vulnerability with people with shared values, that would be the caveat.
Yep.
If you show that, it's magnetizing.
Yeah.
Because you're like, oh, you're existing, which allows me space to exist.
Yeah.
And how fantastic is that?
Totally.
So then I'm not perfect or I'm struggling with this. So now, Zac, you can show up and you can struggle with that. It doesn't have to be the same thing.
Yeah.
But now we can play on that level and it creates like a certain level of trust.
And it's like, I don't have to put this facade on or anything like that. Yeah, absolutely.
So sometimes it's not burdening somebody with something. Sometimes when you're emotionally vulnerable with somebody, it's offering them a gift and an opportunity to be emotionally vulnerable themselves and to actually exist.
Yeah.
Which is quite fun. And also it's just fucking easier.
Oh, it's way easier.
I'm not supposed to swear. I'm not supposed to say the F word. Kent told me.
Oh, really? Oh.
But you know what? We're talking about authenticity, so fuck it.
Nice.
Right.
I like it.
So I would say those are kind of the things. And then the inflexible role structures, that changes depending on the culture and so on and so on.
The next point as well is, so when we're using our resources, you know, like our cognitive resources, or just us in general, when we're focused on survival, suddenly are like these social connections are really nice when you think of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right?
Yeah.
Like when you're hungry, when you're in danger, like when you're in a violent home situation or a war, or surrounded by predators or something.
That goes out the window.
Yeah, you're way more worried about that, right? Like, or when you're worried about, like I think that bringing it to like a modern day example, when you're worried about paying the bills, right? And like that, a lot of times those things can actually get in the way of social connection because you're just much more worried and stressed about those kinds of things.
Yeah, because we only have so much bandwidth, right? So if you're a stressed out dad and you've got the kid and he's crying and he needs to be quiet, and you've got this debt and the creditor just called and the car broke down yesterday and your boss might lay you off now, like the amount of bandwidth that you're going to have for being emotionally vulnerable or even able to receive that and to invest in that why can't I speak today? Reciprocal relationship is going to be really low. So that's why burnout also gets in the way.
Yeah.
And you should have mentioned that before, but burnout's another thing that gets in the way of those social connections. We really, really want to make sure that we have those things dealt with. Now, as a kid or as somebody that's in a difficult situation, whether it's, if you're in a war zone or you're dealing with a natural disaster or you're in an abusive relationship or whatever, or you're in debt a lot.
Or if you have a toddler at home, frankly, right? Like I think that a lot of relationships can also, when you think of like the number of relationships that are like, man, we were just like best friends and it was wonderful. And then we had kids. And just taking care of the kids and managing all of these different things, it's maybe you're not in physical danger, but you are in survival mode and you're multitasking more.
Exactly. And like your walnut brain perceives it as being in danger anyways.
Yeah.
Right. Because it perceives pain as danger. So it doesn't get the difference between like my boss is pulling me in for a performance assessment and, the lion's going to eat my head. Like,
well, and
the walnut's kind
of when you have like a low amount of sleep, for example, right? Like which parenting can often have a thing for that as well. Or
basically you're talking about the accumulation of stressors, right?
Totally.
So the accumulation of any type of stressor will decrease that ability to be emotionally connected. So when we're not using our resources for that because we're busy using them to like keep our head above water, we're going to have massive connectivity deficits. So sometimes the work that we do in therapy is mitigating those stressors. Yeah. So that it's not all of the resources and all of the bandwidth are not going to like keeping your head above water. And then we'll get into the social connectivity. So sometimes there's a little bit of a pre-work thing. But and
I think that especially in situations, where somebody's like, you know what, lately I don't even want to see anybody. I don't want to talk to anyone. I just want to stay
which brings me to my next point, Zach.
Yeah.
The other one is like when we fail to invest in others or can't find a way in which to do so. So what you just said, like, I don't even want to see anybody. I don't want to call my friend. I don't want to have that, water cooler talk. I just want to go to my cubicle and like do the thing because I'm like way too stressed out and blah, blah, blah. Then we get into like the degradation of communities, the degradation of the family unit and distractions. So the more we get stressed, and again, social connectivity is the protector, but the more we get stressed, the more we avoid it, which doubles the whole thing down again.
Totally.
So it is definitely, an exponential kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Where like the stress, because you have less of the protector, the stress is going to go at a faster and faster rate.
Exactly. So that's another reason why we want to get it in play. But often I think when we see people that are in a bit of that burnout or super stress land or even into the anxiety and depression, like I think most of our work is proactive. So we're normally seeing people that they're kind of like blah. Like, I don't like this. I'm just swimming, treading water. I'm not having fun anymore. Yeah. Don't know why I'm doing this stuff. Da, da, da. But that is compounded by the removal of the social connectivity. And at that point, that's the last thing that you want to expend your resources doing.
Yeah.
Right? So it becomes a bit of a chicken and the egg. So when you see that, what do we do?
Yeah.
You know what? Like, actually, let's save that for the next part.
Let's do it.
Shall we?
Yeah, Let's save it.
I just like put a little cliffhanger in there. Yeah.
Stay in suspense, everybody.
Yeah.
We'll,
And I think next time, let's chat a little bit about the degradation of communities and the family unit and distractions and stuff like that in a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's do that.
Okay.
We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. Okay, so what do we do with that then?
Yes, because of course it's like easier said than done, right? Especially in this technological age. And I think the thing about the tech thing is it gives us like a false sense of connectivity a little bit. So we'll chat a little bit about that. And let's talk a little bit about the reasons that we lack social connectivity a bit. Should we get into that?
Sure.
Okay. All right. One of the things that we had to add to our intake interview when we're practicing the psychology is how many hours of screen time?
Right. Which is a terrifying question for most people.
It is,
Right.
especially when, because Zach's giving me shit because I just moved my mic and
Yeah,
I made
if
it
you
like
can
a
hear the
terrible sound.
squeaking, we're
Sorry,
good.
that was my fault.
You're good. You're good.
But especially when we like really start to count it, and we're not necessarily counting the screen time at work, although that is a factor, right? But when we start to really clock, like, how much time are you on your Insta? How much time do you watch Netflix for? You know, those like little like memes and jokes about like, haha, I binge watched this entire series. And you're like, that was like 16 hours of you not living.
Yeah.
Like you living through watching somebody else live. That's not a thing. It's not. And I'm not saying all of that is bad. TV as an event, great. You know, we set up the movie theater, blah, 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 and you have a night with your friends, make the popcorn, have your kids around, whatever. But as a daily, those screens are so invasive because what they're doing is they're occupying your time, which is essentially like bandwidth, right? You only have so much of it. And if you give it to that, you're not doing anything in the world. And we know that it has a very negative effect because you're also not producing anything. And humans need to either build something, that's a sense of satisfaction. Like, what was the last thing you built? You know, you do, you're like 3D printer
Yeah,
stuff.
I do all sorts of like 3D printing. So it's constantly something that I'm like printing off a new thing or like
Making
painting
something.
something or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, like I got taught to garden, and Zach knows I'm like the least domestic person on the planet, probably. But I was like gardening things.
Your words, not mine, but sure.
Well, you know that. But you know, gardening things and putting things in the ground and seeing them like go later, or you know, writing something, journaling, playing with your child, interacting, jigsaw puzzling, whatever. But doing something that has some kind of outcome. Right? Like we've created something and you're acting in the world. So the screens erode the time and the ability to do that. They also occupy our minds with certain amounts of external messaging, which at Shift we're like not big fans of. Because you have to be very careful about what is on your screen as well. And not to say again that they're bad. Like, well, I got that masterclass thing, which I quite enjoy. And we're like watching like a cooking thing and we go cook it together, or did like the gardening one. But
I think like specifically with things like Netflix, you know, it's like, okay, do you need to watch the entirety of Friends again? Right. Or like things like that where really it's, you know, if it's much more of just a numbing, like, I don't want to do anything else, or this is just me tuning out of life or whatever.
It's like, are you going to be inert in the world, or are you going to do something about your world? And so there's a couple things with the screens thing. One, it's like, what is the content? Like, are you watching like crime and murder, like kill, destroy, death shows? Because guess what? If you have a bit of anxiety, that's not a good idea. And it's also not a great idea for us to subject ourselves to like certain narratives. So if you're watching like, say, all of the COVID news every single day, it's not going to get you a good mood, right?
Totally.
Watching a bit of stand-up comedy, it's funny, it makes you laugh, great. And then the other part of it is the quantity. And that's why we ask specifically, not for the content, but for how many hours. Like, how many hours? So if we watch a nice movie once a week, good, great. We're in a little thing.
Yeah.
Pick up in your step, nice little event, something to do. If it is on all the time, if there's like a phone or a screen or an iPad or a TV on all of the time, now we've got a problem. And I would like to compare it, I guess, to alcohol. You know, you have a beautiful glass of red wine with dinner. Lovely. Enhances your experience. You want to have like 14 of those a day?
Yeah, that's a problem.
Now we've got a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
So I think it's looking at that. So definitely it interrupts social connectivity. And to bring it back to the social connectivity thing is, if we took out the screen from your living room, let's pretend, screen's gone. And you'll notice in mine, there is none.
Yep.
House is purposely built like that. The builder was like, well, you think blah, 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 that people are going to want to buy a house without any, like, because you have to put the jacks in and stuff like that. And I was like,
Right.
I don't care.
Yeah.
It's like against my values.
Yeah.
So if we're sitting in the living room and there's no screen around and phones are not allowed to walk around my living room either, there's a drop off point, which is like, we'll talk about that in strategy.
Phone
land.
jail.
There's phone jail, and there's a phone jail. I'll show it to you. It's in my boot room. There's like a little basket, and it's got a plug. So it's getting its like little, juiced up or whatever.
Yeah.
But not allowed in the living room. And the reason is, when you have people sitting in a room, what do they automatically do then?
Oh, they just pull their phone out. Absolutely.
Yes, but if the phone is away, what do they do?
Oh, then they start talking to each other.
Yeah, which is
The whole point.
bedrock of
Totally.
social connectivity, right?
Yeah.
And whether we're shooting the shit about, what the garden looks like or what we're going to do tomorrow or, what was the trouble or like goes into emotional depth sometimes, but it doesn't need to. But you're building those connections and that happens very naturally, especially when you have a child in the home as well. Like that is something very special because they're always exploring something. I'm sure like you could speak to this better than I, but they're always looking at something or playing with something or whatever. And it doesn't have to be a kid, but you're increasing the social value. And that's why when we go back in time a little bit, even like, the Irish pub model, someone like picks up an instrument or someone's talking or whatever, that needs to come back because the other things remove us because we become separated easily with like a mass amount of screens. So
Absolutely.
they need to go in that automated sense. Like I said, like not as an event.
Yeah. Okay. So then, and other than screens, what are some of the other things that get in the way?
I mean, work and life stuff, right? I think we sometimes like over focus on financial gain and productivity, especially in a North American society where it is very much about what do we earn? What are we doing? Get the bigger house, da, da, da. And sometimes it's like better to like scale back and go, hey, what is really important? And like we've said, as I think we've well established, the social connectivity thing is a thing. So maybe it's not taking that overtime shift, or maybe it's not taking that like high powered job. Or if you're in that position, maybe doing a bit of time chunking so you do get off at 5 so you can have that time with your family to do the family dinner and then to hang out with your friends and prioritizing that over productivity. Because I'll tell you one thing, nobody asks for their P&L on their deathbed.
Well, and I think that like kind of going along with that, when we do like the life analysis with people at, with clients and things like that. But I think in general, people don't prioritize the other things in life. They don't use the things that, or the strategies or the skills or whatever to prioritize work stuff and plan it out. And they don't bring it into, other areas of their life.
Well, like I said, I don't think people like understand that they have a bandwidth, like you have a certain amount of time and mental value and you have to cut it up. And the way you cut it up, if you're going to have a satisfied existence, is cutting it up based on your value structure, right? So, and then the other thing I think that is difficult that we sometimes do a little bit of work with clients on is educating them that you can't have like this endless to-do list of like all these work pieces to do. I have to achieve this and this and this and this and this and this. That's going to deplete you. Like you still need some fun and some satisfaction and some of the good things, because when we go back to it, we go like, why are you doing the thing in the first place then? Like,
and there's almost this like, and I don't think that people like intentionally come into things thinking, well, fun isn't important to me, but it's almost like becoming an adult is like, well, now fun is being juvenile or something like that. And I think that part of that, without me getting like, I don't know, diving headlong into like the dark side of capitalism or whatever, right? But just
no, but it is like, and you should go there,
right? That is absolutely the, if you are looking to other people, specifically like
for-profit corporations or companies or your boss or whatever to look for how should I prioritize things in my life, they're going to want, they have their own agenda, and you have to be able to hold the line and say, no, my having fun is important to me. My family is important to me.
Time to do nothing.
Yeah.
Spend with your pets and whatnot. And this is, obviously ironic considering like I'm a business owner. However, it is a couple things, and it goes back to that other point I was saying about the screens, and be careful what comes into your head. Like, what do you need? How should you be careful where that programming is coming from? Because do you need, like, Zach, would an Escalade on your driveway make you happier?
Probably not.
No, but for a lot of people, there are Escalade versions of things.
Sure.
And not to get on Cadillac, because they make nice cars, blah, 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 don't sue us. But you have to figure out what the Escalade version of your happiness is, and what is difficult is it's not just this one thing. It's not like I want a yacht or I want this big house or whatever. It's the clip out of what does a human actually need in order to be happy, which is a lot of social connectivity, purpose, fun,
Totally.
productivity, learning, and so on and so on. And that's why that life analysis thing is so important, because all of those components have to be present, not just like once a month,
Right.
every single week.
Yeah.
So kind of go with that. So the devaluation of fun and play and nurturance is a thing, because there are also these really quiet moments that don't seem like you're doing anything in a productive capitalist society. For instance, like when, and I'm sure you've seen this. So when your wife had your babies, I'm sure she spent a lot of time just sitting and holding them.
Yeah.
Doesn't look like she's doing much, but from an evolutionary perspective,
That's the whole, that's everything.
she is doing something extremely purposeful.
Yeah.
And it's still, right? It's a still quiet moment. So it doesn't look like there's a lot of work going into it, but to hold the child and nurture them, like that is a very important thing. And sometimes we forget it, because we want to push people back out to like go earn, go buy, go do the thing, go watch. But there are beautiful things in that still kind of moment, and they're very purposeful and very productive, but they're just not productive in the mainstream narrative. So it's examining that and going and questioning your life and go, hey, what do I do? And productivity might be meditating. And I'll tell you one of mine. Let's do one for one.
Sure. Yeah.
Want to do that? Okay. So when I get really stressed out or whatever, and I like work like a demon, blah, blah, and I do have to like put this in check. One of my most productive moments is I will go up to my library and I will sit with my two birds that like look at me like crazy psycho stalkers, and I'll like have a nice little like those half naps with the sun shining in. I'll do that for hours. And in terms of like filling up the energy to be able to go launch all of the other things that are going to happen later that day, that moment of enjoyment, which is like not like fun capital, but enjoyment in kind of almost a meditative state.
Yeah.
And connectivity with my like little birds.
Yeah.
Very, very productive, but just not in the normal script. It's not in the running time. So
absolutely.
You do one for me.
So mine, like one of mine is very similar to yours, where it's just like, I just need to go. And again, I have like 4 young kids at home. And so my wife and I will both do this, where we'll tag team, and I will go, it's like, I'm going downstairs and laying down on the bed and turning the lights off for like half an hour, put some kind of, not white noise, but more of like something like that.
Pleasant
right?
sound.
It's just something like that, right? That is very, that is something that's really helpful for me, and just sort of grounding more than anything, to be like, okay, I feel good, like recharge sort of thing. The other one is actually playing Dungeons and Dragons with my son, which he's 9 years old, and we do that. We try to do it like once a week. And it's hilarious because he's old enough now that he's sort of coming up with his own stuff, and he's running the game and like telling stories that he wants to tell, and like it's encouraging him to be creative, but we're doing it together. So that's the other thing as well, is that it's very it's
connective.
It's very connective, and it's also very much like a nurturing thing for him to feel like really, engaged and fulfilled, and like.
But I think like
get that feedback.
one of the things then is that we devalue these moments. We're like, that's nothing. I'm being lazy. I'm not being productive. I encourage my clients to take time and put it in your schedule. Like put it in your schedule that you're going to do these types of things.
Absolutely.
Whether it's the D&D with your son, whether it's me hanging out in my library, whether it's sitting and reading for a bit, whether it's having a nap in the middle of the day, whether it's like one of my other ones was I went for that big thunderstorm we had. I love thunderstorms, something fierce.
Yeah.
Got the umbrellas out, which is probably bad because they're metal, whatever. But went for a big walk with a friend of mine in that. And those moments are so restorative. So you can counteract a lot of what drains people. And the reason that is relevant to social connectivity is if you are consistently drained, you are not going to have the appetite for people because it does take work. It takes work to have a conversation. It takes work to like call somebody up, make a date, have a FaceTime thing, or go out, whatever. So if you're depleted, that's not going to be possible. So you have to fill yourself up in whatever way speaks to you. Like we said, we gave you 2 examples, 3 actually. It does it differently for you versus me, but like figure out what your thing is and what is going to fill it up because that matters a lot. Because anybody that thinks that I'm just going to like run, and I'm just going to achieve, I'm sadly mistaken.
It's sort of this paradox too, where on one hand, this, like social connection needs to be something that is on your to-do list and like something that is scheduled in. And at the same time, you cannot like that cannot be your attitude about it is, oh, okay. Yeah. And also I have to do this, right? It's like, no, that's the thing you get to do. That's the thing that you want to be like excited about doing.
Well, and that's why I think it's very important for people to have an awareness about like which way they want to do that. Right?
Which could lead into an entire conversation that's almost a different podcast, which is if you are like, there are probably people in your life that feel much more like it's draining you than it is restoring that energy. And I think we
do have a podcast about that. I believe it's the toxic people one.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Check that one out.
Yeah.
In terms of like obligation, but if you go into it and you figure out like, what is my best like moment with somebody? Like, what do I really want to do? Whether it's like going for that thunderstorm walk or going for a regular pedicure or playing D&D with your kid. Like, and they're not necessarily like socially prescribed things either.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you're not going to like Google, like, how do I connect with my child? D&D comes up. No.
Yeah.
But figuring out like, and who you want. Because there is one thing about social connectivity. It doesn't need a large span. So you don't need a giant network. You just need a lot of moments of that feeling.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's enough to sort of remind you like, okay, yes, this is what life's really about. This is right. Like,
well, and speaking of that, I think it gets us into our next thing, which is like setting priorities intentionally, like really deciding what you're doing with your time. Like, and in a shift, we call this our deathbed values or deathbed priorities. And it's like I said, it's not a P&L sheet. It's not a Cadillac in the driveway that people are going to ask for when you're at that moment. So one refocusing thing that we do is get your client or get yourself, and in my case, myself, my friends, whatever. What would you ask for? Like, what would you want at that moment? And like, turn back and look. Are you building it right now? Because like we have this moment to build it right now.
Yeah. And there's a lot of interesting research around like deathbed regrets and things like that. And nobody ever wishes like, oh man, I wish I would have got that promotion or I wish I would have worked more. It's always should have prioritized my relationships, should have been more present in the moment, should have enjoyed the little things like, and again, relationships
more time off.
Exactly. Like so much of that has to do with relationships.
It's a lot of relationships. And like generally speaking, and we hear it like even last week we had a death in the family, and the thing that was so important that everybody understood without talking about it was he able to see his people? And when you talk about the impact then of social connectivity, that is that in like a microcosm.
Absolutely.
Like, what is the one thing? If you were in that state where it's like, okay, I'm about to leave this place, what is the one thing you would want around you?
Yeah, absolutely. Family. Absolutely. Family, friends.
Family, friends, connection. So I think then we have to take that from that and go incrementally backwards to breed that because we can't live lives where that is not the capital thing and then expect it on the end. And it's a dark thought, obviously, but not if you're doing it.
Yeah.
So we're talking about, now we're going to chat a little bit, I think, about how to create that.
Totally. Yeah. Let's do that. Yeah. So, I mean, like one of the first ones we talked a few minutes ago about screens and about, like online things. I think one of the first ones is get into the real world, right? Like, I think for me, one of the things that has really over this whole COVID situation has been that, like, at first I was like, oh, you know what? Like, this isn't so bad to like talk to somebody on the phone or whatever. And then you actually see somebody in person again. And you're like, holy shit, I missed this, right? Like immediately. And so like, I think absolutely doing those things in person, whether it's, just having dinner with, with family or friends and things like that. Like, what are some of the things that come to mind for you?
Well, we've been doing a whole bunch of stuff because, like, you know how I am. I'm like turbo on everything. So we like planted a garden. We did like a giant, Kent, who hates when I talk about him on air, is
Hi, Kent.
Hi, Kent. You're a thing. Please put your picture on the website. He's my tech co-founder. Anyway, they were up, went on a massive bike ride through the river valley, watched the poplar fluff, and built out some meals. I think cooking with people is really good. Had the nieces over, like just doing things in the world with people. And that is a difficult thing currently, right? Because we've got some COVID stuff. But, it doesn't have to be. Because even if you only have one person in your house, or if you're doing a cohort thing, you can still like build something or do something and connect with that. And I've been very careful because I knew that this would become a time of dependency on technology. And I am very wary of tech. I like it, which is weird for a co-founder of a tech company to say also. But it's like figuring out how can you learn about things? How can you apply that learning? How can you involve somebody else in that learning? And you have a lot of fun with it. Like my neighbor was teaching me how to garden and she's like, no, literally put your hands in this dirt. And I was like, there's a worm there. And she's like, keep going. I was like, no, but there's an actual word. Like I can't. And she's like, put these gloves on and plant the fucking plants. I'm like, okay, whatever. Like you'll meet her. It's funny.
Yeah.
But it's deriving things that do associate with those deathbed values. And I think one way that everyone can identify them is like figure out what your traits are first, and then figure out what really matters. Like the only thing you want is your takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely. And knowing like, does this move me towards that or not?
Exactly.
Right.
Because you know the end point, so go incrementally backwards from that. And in the business world, we would call that like a BHAG, like your biggest, like giant goal. You're like, I want to do this. And then you take it back like 5 years, 1 year, each month, and then down into the week and the day. So in your day, are you doing anything that honors those deathbed values or not? So if I like get up and work and then watch a bunch of TV and then no, I'm not. So it's embedding those tiny little things about how do you create that in your day.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, because I think that to add on top of that, I think that it's very valuable to like allocate time to do these things, but also allocate time to reflect on, am I actually doing this? Like to hold yourself accountable so that you're, to check in and say, okay, well, these are things however long ago that I said were really important to me that I was going to start to work to cultivate in my life, and actually like take time later on, maybe frankly, like on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly basis, whatever makes sense, but to something to say, okay, well, this is something I said I was going to do. How am I doing on that?
Well, it's very easy. Like, one of the things we do, like, because I work with a lot of like CEOs, C-class, whatever, because I like mind train leadership a lot. One of the things we do is we put in their schedule a planning hour. And in that planning hour, they're doing something called our black book. And our black book is, what is your like game plan, your like big long-term goal? And like, what are you doing for it this week with that? And you start putting it in as a rhythm. Because if you have to decide on it every single day, it's going to be very difficult. Right? If you have to wake up and be like, how do I like, prioritize my deathbed values? That's a big thing, whatever, too much. Like,
Yeah, totally.
I wouldn't be a fan of that. And some days we get lazy. We're humans. We get tired. And like right now, I probably want to go for a nap after this podcast.
Yeah.
But if I've got my week set out to have that in, like I'm going to make sure that I have, and I do, like, and this is mine. I have this kid that I love, Heaven. And so we have a thing together planned on Saturday. And then we have like another thing. And then I've got another thing with another person and so on and so on. And that restorative time all put in the thing and like movement as well. So all the components of like what makes people happy integrated in your week, done, decided.
And I think that starting with like what your values are and making that a priority. Also, then when you get to the point where it's like, oh yeah, I said I was going to do this thing, it also you're also able very quickly to there's a why behind it, right? And and so then you're able to be like, okay, like maybe I'm feeling tired and I do want a nap, but this thing is even more important than my nap is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And like being motivated and having that time chunking stuff does help with that. So it's not only allocating time, which is important because often it's easier. It's easier to sit on the couch. It's easier to just like pop on a show or flip through your phone or whatever. It's, of course, that's easier than calling up your friend and connecting and asking them about how they are. But it's just that initial thing, right? So people that go to the gym regularly, for instance, and there's like lots of studies on this, they have it in their rhythm. They don't think about it. Like they get up, they go to the gym, da-da-da, and repeat. Or people that like have certain interactions with their children, and you like get up, you pick them up, we go to the park.
Yeah.
And it's on a rhythm. You don't want to have it so that you have to think about it every moment.
Yeah.
Because there's going to be, if you do things mood dependently, no,
That's just, you're not
humans
gonna
are
get
terrible
you won't
at
get
that.
anything done.
Like mood dependently, do you want to eat the salad or the cupcake? Yeah, don't ride it on mood. So
Yeah.
the other one with it, and this is a challenging one for many people, is like daring to be vulnerable. One of the things that gets in the way, and we talked about this a little bit earlier on, is with social connectivity, you actually have to like show some of yourself. And, you know, sorry, a lot of us have been trained to, you know, put this perfect exterior on because if we do that, then everyone's going to like us, right?
Absolutely.
And Zach, how well does that work?
No, that's just it just ends up being like fake, right? Like people have a very good bullshit meter.
Yeah, actually, and Gottman studied that quite
Yeah.
well.
Oh, absolutely.
But the other thing about it is if you show a vulnerability point and if you present something real, it gives room for the other person to also exist. And now we're in an actual exchange.
Yeah.
Because if I show that, then you can show that. And like you and I have a like fairly good bond.
Sure.
How'd that happen?
Absolutely. Well, because we can actually be authentic and vulnerable and real and like just, you know, like I think it's like even the parts of me that maybe I'm embarrassed about, we've talked about some of those things.
Well, and same in kind. And it has to be in kind.
Yes.
And the other thing is I was talking to a business owner the other day and he's like, well, you gotta keep these things separate. And like Shift does work a bit differently than most businesses internally, but I think it's good. So he's like, well, you gotta keep that out and they can't see you cry or be weak or whatever. And I was like,
Yeah, you're telling me that if you actually see, you know, like your boss be a real person, and granted, there are probably some, you know, some that will take advantage of that, but for the most part, like really, for me at least, what it creates is buy-in, right? And that there's actually like in a work setting even, right, where it's like there is buy-in that takes place where we're on the same page, and I like there is now like okay, well I like.
you can ask me shit.
I can feel good about, you know, spending my time and energy because at the end of the day, I know that you give a shit of everything.
But that's the thing that like with authenticity is like if you show up and whether it's in a friend land or a family land or a workplace land, if you show up and you're like, hey, here's my day today, you can exist as well. Because if I tell you I'm this, or I'm like, well, I opened this podcast. I said, like, I got up too early this morning. So I don't even know if I can make words. And you're like, fine. And then you countered with an immediate story about how you don't like mornings either. And that's a connectivity point. It's not a big one, but we get into it. And I think that a lot of people show up and they want to be this perfect version of themselves. And that is like it's absolute murder for social connectivity. Because if we're all running around trying to do these, like proving it in the world, trying to like, have the perfect house and the perfect kids and like never show any weakness, whatever, you're also erasing everyone else's ability to exist as well. And that's like the backwards flip one, that one. Because I think most of the time people think that it's going to be only erasing their own.
Yeah.
But when you can't show up, actually, you're erasing everyone else's as well.
Yeah.
Which is like
Absolutely. Because then it's like, okay, well, what are the rules here for this game we're playing? Like suddenly now I need to know like what is allowed and not allowed, and I have to.
Well, if you have to be a certain way, then I have to be a certain way. So the fact that I don't have to be a certain way with you means that
you can just be yourself.
Exactly. And maybe that's in line, maybe it's not. And then you actually have a venue to understand whether your values align or not. And sometimes they won't. Right? Like I've done that where I'm like, and I'm sure you have as well.
Yeah.
Where you're in front of someone where you're like, oh, we're not on the same page and we are not going to get on the same page.
Yeah.
Which is good. You want to know that.
It's interesting actually. This was actually, when did this happen? Last week? So I have a friend that goes back to like high school. And without getting into too much detail, the kind of town that I grew up in. And he lives in Edmonton. He works for, well, I won't say too much about him.
Yeah,
but he reached out to me and was like, essentially was like, dude, I need some friends. Right. Like and we haven't talked for like such a long time. And I am a very different person than I was when I was growing up and when I was friends with him. And him and I over the years have had some choice words with each other. And he was like, dude, I don't have, I like whatever, like I would just, life is too short for that shit is basically what he said. And I was like, oh, like I was very taken back.
Just so you know, he did a lean back right there.
Yeah.
Just so you know.
I was like, wait a minute. Like, is that, like I was taken off guard, and there was some conversation about like I was very honest with him, and it was also vulnerability as far as like almost I guess boundaries, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but to be fair, you're very confident in your own skin now.
Oh, totally. Yeah, absolutely.
So you could be like, you could entertain that conversation.
And so like we had a good conversation about like, well, what do we do with this? What do we do with this? And he's like, I don't know, whatever. And interestingly, it ended up being, well, I don't think we're actually on nearly as different pages as you think we are, is what he said to me. And I was like, okay, well, it worked. And it was, and it was something that even for me, like I was the person in this story that was like, no. Like I am the one on guard. And he was the one coming to me being like, no, hey, we should try and reconnect. And I was like, by the end of it, I was like, okay, actually, I feel good about this.
Well, the thing is, Zac, people naturally are connective. Remember, like when we don't put all of that veneer of bullshit on, we're naturally connective. Like very much so. And you saw that because there's like, trepidations and differences in values. But at the end of the day, he was like, hey, I want to do this with you. And you're like, and you get it done a little bit.
And eventually it was, I think the thing that is that by the time it was done, it was obvious, like there was definitely that vulnerability. There was definitely that essentially the takeaway was, yeah, but this friendship that we used to have really was meaningful and is more meaningful than whatever bullshit got in the way before, which was awesome. It's
funny. So, and I like that. So you're going to pursue that?
Yeah.
Good.
Absolutely. Now there's still the other obstacle of we are both dads of small children, which is
well, that would go into our thing though.
Absolutely.
A little bit of like, there are some like physical, especially in this current pandemic state, there are some things, but again, I think it goes back to allocating time and figuring out a way.
Absolutely.
Because like you and your wife
it's definitely doable.
She can like and you can go off and do that. And not everyone obviously has that like dual family. Obviously, it's a lot harder for, I imagine like this for a single mom would be like, a lot. But ask your fucking neighbor.
Absolutely.
Like
Yeah.
make friends and ask that. Like even when okay, so I treat my birds like babies, which is like an entire fucking other podcast of crazy. We'll ignore
Okay.
that right now.
Yeah.
But I was like, you know what? Anita, who lives next door to me, I was like, Gigi, and she's like, I'll just pop over and I'll just like hang out with her. I was like, what? She's screaming. I got a podcast going on. She's like, no, I'll come do it. So when you have a network, when you have a neighborhood, when you establish a community, which again takes work and is like out of our houses and out of our comfort zone, it works though. So that way, like Hillary and her friend or whatever could come over and you could go out and establish that friendship. And how beautiful is that?
Oh, totally. Absolutely.
More and more and more. So I would say like the other part of it, and maybe we'll close on this, Zac, if you're okay
Sure.
with that.
Yeah. That's good.
The other thing I think with people is the biggest, Dabrowski's hierarchy of needs, not Maslow's, Dabrowski's. The highest level of Dabrowski's hierarchy of needs is be of service to others.
I like that.
The greatest level of satisfaction that humans get is being of service. If you realize that other people are struggling in the same way with you, like in terms of connectivity, so we don't feel, and there's limiting beliefs involved in that. And we hit some of those out at Shift, obviously. Like I'm a burden, I'm going to bother them and blah, blah, blah. But understand that the vast majority of people, especially in our society, are also isolated and they also want that. And I think it was a very bold and brave thing for your friend to reach out and say,
totally.
like that is a very bold and brave thing.
Yeah.
Kudos to him
And
for
it
doing
was
that.
absolutely, it was to reach out. And then also when there's some hesitation, he's like, no, but really, which was
Yes.
even like,
No, that's
Absolutely.
that's a fucking rare thing and
Absolutely.
a beautiful thing. But I think there are many people walking around with that same, and it's not, I think, I know, actually. Let me take out the passive language in that one.
Right.
Because the amount of our clients, the amount of my friends that do need someone to be like, hey, what's up?
yeah.
Hang out. It is not a burden. So the next time you're in front of your barista or your waitress or hanging out with your friend or brother-in-law or whatever it is, actually do it. Do the thing where you sit down and you go, hey, do you want to hang out? Do you want to talk? Because guaranteed, 90% of those people are in the same position. So if you feel lonely, the best antidote for it, the best antidote for a lack of social connectivity is go find other people that have a lack of social connectivity and connect because it's willing.
This is why nerds band together so much, by the way. We're geek culture is such a cohesive thing. Absolutely. Because I think it's cool to be a geek now, but anyway.
But the other thing is like I said, it's giving of yourself.
Absolutely.
Well, and and the giving, people think it's I have to go get a volunteer position or I have to do that. Sometimes it's literally just going and asking how are you doing? What's up? Having that conversation. I'll end on this one little anecdote, if you'll allow me.
Yeah.
And this is so my neighbor, Anita, I mentioned her. She's taught me a bunch of lessons.
Cool.
So we're standing in the back alley talking about our garbage bins because people in Westmount steal garbage bins, which is a problem.
Okay.
So we're talking about this. And this homeless guy comes up and she goes, would you like some bottles? And runs back into the house to get them. And so him and I are sitting there and he's like, my name's Dave. And before she ran back into the house, she gave him a hug. And I was like, oh, now fuck. And this is in the midst of the COVID thing also. The pandemic and blah, blah. And she's doing that. And I was like, Jesus. So he puts his hand out. I take his hand. And I said to her, I was so ashamed in my own brain for not being able to bring it that level. But I think we all have something to aspire to in terms of connection, right?
Yeah.
And we've talked about that. And it doesn't have to come where it looks like it will come. And go get it.
Yeah.
Because it's all around us. There's what is it? 7.5 billion of us now?
Yeah.
So it walks amongst us.
Yeah, absolutely.
So go on and get it.
Yeah. So I'm excited to hear back from people, by the way. I think that's something that I'm always interested in, is hearing back from how people are actually doing this. So definitely let us know what you're doing, because that I think is also very cool to hear stories and things like that.
I like resiliency stories. And also we've got a COVID protocol out that you
Absolutely.
did, which was awesome.
Yeah.
For like nothing. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's totally free right now. That is on the website shiftpsych.com. And we've got all sorts of resources there. So check that out for sure, because it goes all into the life analysis thing that we talked about.
And Zac, if someone wanted to get in touch with you specifically, how would they do that?
Me specifically, yeah. So you could email me at Zac, that's ZAC.Erickson, ERICKSON @shiftpsych.team. So you can send me stuff and we'll bring it to the podcast. And
whatever you want to know.
We're not gonna do like therapy on the podcast, right? No. But I mean,
it's like you gotta pay us for that shit.
But I'm totally excited to hear from people about about things that we can talk about on the podcast.
Well, topics that you want to know about, like let us know. Like,
yeah, just put podcast question in the subject line so I can find them, and that's perfect. That's all we need. So
we like it.
Cool.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Shift Show. Be sure to check out our website, shiftpsych.com, for more great content to help you optimize your life. Follow us on social media at ShiftPsych, and let us know if you have ideas or things you'd really like to hear about on the podcast. If you found this useful or interesting, which you probably did since you're still here, please share and review the show. And make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. This lets us know that you like what you hear, so we can bring you more of it. The podcast was brought to you by Shift Psych's results-driven mind trainers. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on The Shift Show.